It's 2:13 a.m. The city is asleep, but the lights in Government House never go off. Power, after all, does not rest, and neither do those who wield it. I sit by the window, watching the drizzle fall over the deserted courtyard. The flag flutters weakly against the wind. Tomorrow, I will raise my right hand and swear again to serve the people. The irony doesn't escape me. On this very night 4 years ago, I knelt before Chief Akin, the same man whose empire I buried without remorse. Back then he called me his son. Now I suppose he calls me his mistake. People love to speak about power as if it's earned through charisma or intellect. That's a lie. Power is taken, often from those who think they own it forever, and Chief Akin thought he did. They call me the first governor to defeat a godfather in our political history. I suppose that's true, but they don't understand I didn't just defeat him. I studied him. I became him. Then, when the time was right, I destroyed him with the same tools he used to control others. This isn't a confession born of guilt. It's a record, a testimony of how corruption consumes its own. I met Chief Akin 10 years ago, long before I ever imagined sitting in this chair. I was a restless lawyer, known in activist circles for my speeches about reform and justice. That was what caught his attention, my mouth, not my mind. He invited me to his mansion one humid evening. I still remember the smell, a blend of imported whiskey, cigar smoke, and old men's secrets. His laughter was thunderous, his belly wide, his handshake warm but heavy, like he wanted to remind you who owned your hand. "Ebuka," he said, calling me by my first name as though we were equals. "You have something this country doesn't produce anymore: fire. Let's put that fire to good use." That was how it began. He told me stories of how he built the political machinery that ran our state, how he installed 3 governors, hand-picked senators, and buried enemies with a phone call. His living room walls were lined with portraits of men who owed him their rise. Each one looked powerful in public, but I could tell from the way he spoke about them that they were all puppets. I was to be the next. He needed someone young, articulate, and clean, a new face to cover the old rot. I was perfect. I didn't have the money, but I had what he wanted: credibility. The deal was simple. He'd fund my campaign. I'd govern by his script. In his words, "You'll be the face, I'll be the engine." I agreed. I told myself it was only for a while, that I'd change the system from within. But deep down, I already knew, power never releases those it captures. The campaign was a storm. Chief Akin ran it like a war. Money flowed from untraceable accounts. Media houses bowed to his influence. Ward leaders were bribed or threatened. When I protested, he smiled and said, "My boy, this is how the sausage is made. You can't clean a house from outside." I learned quickly. Every speech I made about integrity was financed by stolen funds. Every poster of my smiling face was printed with dirty money. The irony made me sick, but I swallowed it. On election night, I watched the results roll in from the Situation Room, all orchestrated, all predictable. When the final numbers were announced, I was declared winner with a margin wide enough to make the opposition look ridiculous. Chief Akin hugged me in front of the cameras. The crowd chanted his name louder than mine. He leaned toward my ear and whispered, "Remember who made you." I nodded. At that moment, I truly believed I owed him everything. Governance under Chief Akin's shadow was suffocating. Every appointment required his approval. Every contract, every project, every press statement, his fingerprints were on them all. His boys flooded the civil service. Commissioners came to my office only after visiting his mansion. Even my chief of staff was one of his loyalists. I could barely breathe without his permission. When I tried to push for reforms, digital procurement systems, merit-based hearing, transparency policies, he called me one night and said calmly, "You're forgetting who you are, my son. You're not here to reform anything. You're here to maintain order." By order, he meant his order. The first time I disobeyed him, he reminded me of my debt. He sent me a folder containing evidence of the election fraud, video clips, bank transfers, affidavits signed by compromised officials. "Don't bite the hand that made you," he warned, "or I'll make you wish you never had one." That night I didn't sleep. I realized I wasn't a governor. I was a hostage wearing a designer suit. For the next year I played the loyal son. I signed the documents he sent. I attended the parties he arranged. But quietly I began to build something else, my own network. I replaced his loyalists one by one, not by firing them, but by promoting them out of relevance. I gave them meaningless titles: senior special advisor on grassroots liaison, fancy names for political exile. At the same time, I recruited young technocrats, people who owed their rise to me alone. I funded community projects directly through them, bypassing Akin's influence. Slowly, the people began to see me, not him. That was when the war began. It started with silence. His calls came less frequently, his tone colder. Then came the rumors, whispers that I was forgetting my roots, that I'd become arrogant. A month later, one of my aides was arrested for embezzlement. The documents that framed him came from Akin's office. It was a message, the Godfather reminding me of his reach. So I sent one back. I commissioned a financial audit of every state contract awarded in the last 8 years, his 8 years of control. I didn't announce it publicly. I just let him hear about it through the right channels. Within days, he called me. "Are you trying to fight me?" "No, Chief," I said calmly, "just cleaning up the system." "Be careful, my son. You might drown in the dirt you stir." He ended the call abruptly. That was when I knew the Godfather no longer saw me as a son. He saw me as a threat. But I had no intention of losing. For years, men like him had turned our democracy into a personal business empire, trading public offices like market stalls. I would end that cycle, even if it meant burning down everything we built together. The breaking point came when he tried to sponsor a vote of no confidence against me in the state assembly. He bribed lawmakers, funded protests, and planted stories in the press. But what he didn't know was that I had already turned his inner circle. The same men he trusted with the plot were feeding me every detail. When the motion was finally tabled, I walked into the assembly unannounced, confident, flanked by security. The cameras were rolling. I addressed the chamber directly. "Some men believe the will of the people is a commodity to be purchased. I say it is not. This government will not bow to blackmail, no matter how powerful the hands behind it." The motion failed spectacularly. That day, for the first time, the public saw me stand alone. That night, Chief Akin went on television. He smiled for the cameras, praised my leadership, and called the event a family misunderstanding. But his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes. They carried the quiet rage of a wounded lion. The Godfather had been humiliated in public. I knew what would come next. And I was ready. Chief Akin didn't strike immediately. That was his style. He liked to let his enemies grow comfortable before he crushed them. For months, there was an eerie calm. I could feel him watching me through silence. Then came the first blow. A scandal erupted overnight. The media claimed that my administration had misappropriated billions from a rural development project. The evidence was convincing, detailed, official-looking, complete with leaked internal memos and forged signatures. It was textbook Akin. He knew how to wound without drawing blood. The story spread across radio stations and social media, fueled by faceless accounts and desperate journalists chasing ad clicks. My opponents celebrated. Civil groups demanded my resignation. My chief press secretary asked how I wanted to respond. I told him, "We don't defend lies, we outlive them." But privately, I knew I couldn't ignore this. Not because of the scandal itself. I'd seen worse, but because of the precision, only someone inside my government could have leaked those documents. So I started an internal probe, quiet, thorough, ruthless. Within days, we discovered the mole, my permanent secretary for finance. He'd been on Aachen's payroll for years. When my security chief brought him in for questioning, he was trembling like a schoolboy. "Sir, I didn't mean harm," he said. "The chief promised protection. He said he could destroy anyone." I leaned forward and said, "Then let him protect you from what comes next." He was dismissed before nightfall, not fired, dismissed. The message was clear: betrayal was terminal. But Aachen didn't stop there. Next, he began dismantling my political base. He lured back old allies I'd sidelined, ward leaders, party financiers, legislators, with promises of cash and influence. Soon, they formed a faction within the ruling party, claiming I lost touch with the grassroots. He was building a shadow army. Then, as election season approached, his coup took shape. He unveiled his chosen candidate, a young, photogenic businessman named Daniel, a man who once called me mentor. Aachen had groomed him quietly, funding his foundation, polishing his public image. When Daniel declared his intention to run for governor, the crowd roared like it had found a savior. The message was unmistakable: the Godfather was replacing his son. I won't lie, for a brief moment, I felt the old fear. The same fear I'd felt when I was just a lawyer standing before the great Chief Aachen, dazzled by his reach. But fear is only useful when it sharpens you, and that night it did. I called an emergency meeting with my inner circle, 5 people I trusted completely. We gathered in the old strategy room, the one without cameras or microphones. On the table lay a printed dossier titled Operation Eclipse. I said nothing for a long while, then opened the first page. "Gentlemen," I began, "the chief has declared war, and we will not defend, we will conquer." My plan was simple: not to fight his fire but to suffocate it. I would dismantle the very pillars of his empire: money, loyalty, and myth. To defeat a godfather, you don't attack him directly, you starve him. You dry up his cash flow, weaken his connections, make him doubt his allies until he's surrounded by ghosts. I started with his finances. Through a discreet task force, we traced state contracts linked to his companies, shell firms that had fed fat on inflated deals for over a decade. We reopened investigations into those projects, quietly freezing the accounts. Publicly, I said nothing. But within weeks, Aachen's empire began to choke. Contractors complained of unpaid bills. His loyalists grumbled. Then I moved to loyalty. Every man has a price, even those who swear eternal allegiance. I sent quiet emissaries to his lieutenants, offering them what Aachen could no longer guarantee: protection and access. Some refused, others didn't. Soon his meetings grew smaller. His voice on radio sounded tired. The once feared name Chief Aachen started drawing whispers, not bows. But I wasn't done. The final strike was myth, the legend that he was untouchable, invincible. To destroy that, I needed him to fall publicly. So I gave him the illusion of a comeback. A few months before the party primaries, I accidentally leaked news that I planned to step down after one term. The bait worked perfectly. Aachen became overconfident. He poured millions into Daniel's campaign, mobilized old networks, and held secret meetings across the state. I let him. In truth, every meeting was being recorded, every transaction monitored. My security unit infiltrated his team so deeply that even his driver worked for us. When the day of the primaries came, the entire party watched. The hall was tense, cameras flashing, supporters chanting. Chief Aachen stood proudly behind Daniel, smiling like a king reclaiming his throne. Then, as results were about to be announced, the party chairman received a sealed envelope. Inside were the recordings, bank statements, and witness testimonies. all showing Chief Akin had bribed delegates with stolen government funds. The chairman turned pale. Within an hour, a disciplinary committee was announced. Daniel's candidacy was nullified. Chief Akin was summoned for questioning. The hall descended into chaos. The cameras caught his shock, his trembling hands. For the first time, the Godfather looked small. I remained silent. I didn't need to speak. The people saw the truth, or at least the version I allowed them to see. That night, I received a call. "Ebuka," he said quietly, "you've become what you used to hate." "No, Chief," I replied. "I've become what you feared." He exhaled. "You think you've won." I said, "I think you've been replaced." And I ended the call. Weeks later, the Anti-Corruption Agency announced a full-scale investigation into contracts linked to his businesses. By the next month, they froze his assets. His mansion was raided. The newspapers called it the fall of the Godfather. I didn't correct them. In truth, it wasn't just a fall, it was an execution. I had dismantled his kingdom piece by piece, until all that remained was a man stripped of illusion, power, and pride. He went silent for a long time after that. Then, one evening, he showed up at Government House unannounced. The guards almost stopped him, but I let him in. He walked slowly, his once broad frame now stooped. When he entered my office, I stood, out of courtesy, not respect. "You've done well," he said, "but remember, power eats its own. One day someone will do to you what you did to me." I smiled faintly. "Then I'll die knowing I trained them well." He stared at me for a long time, then turned and left. That was the last time I saw him. The storm didn't come with thunder. It came quietly, in typed reports, sealed envelopes, and sworn testimonies. The Economic and Financial Commission, EFC, announced a sweeping investigation into the diversion of state contracts. The first name on the list was Chief Sylvanus Akin, the Godfather himself. When the news broke, the old man was at a political rally, smiling before a sea of loyalists waving banners. He didn't know that his convoy was already being shadowed by unmarked SUVs. Within hours, the story dominated every headline. Former party leader Chief Akin questioned over 14 billion contract scandal. The networks ran with it for days, but what the public didn't know was how deep the rot went, or how far back I had started digging. Months earlier, while Chief Akin still thought he had the strings in his hands, I had commissioned a private forensic team, not from the police, not from the EFC, but from outside the country. Their task: to trace every shell company that had ever received a state contract under Akin's supervision. It took them 4 months to uncover a spiderweb of corruption that spanned years, construction firms that didn't exist, consultancy contracts that led to offshore accounts, and ghost workers who drew salaries from ministries that had long ceased to operate. But this was more than an anti-corruption crusade. It was a reckoning. Chief Akin had tried to bury me. Now I was going to bury his empire, not with bullets or thugs, but with truth. When the investigators finally arrived at his mansion, Chief Akin didn't resist. He smiled faintly, as though he had seen this before. But behind the calm, there was fear, the kind of fear only men who have ruled for too long can feel when the walls begin to close in. He was taken into custody. His allies began to vanish. The phones of once loyal party members went unanswered. The empire he had built over 20 years began to crumble, not with noise but with silence. And through it all, I said nothing. No press statement. No interviews. No triumphal speeches. Just silence in time. Because revenge, when it finally comes, should not be loud. It should be surgical. A month after his arrest, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Chief Akin himself, written from the correctional center. The handwriting was shaky but still recognizably his, the same man who had once dictated orders like decrees. He requested a private meeting. Against the advice of my cabinet, I agreed. That afternoon, I entered the visitation room flanked by 2 guards. He was seated behind the glass barrier, dressed in a faded brown uniform. The once powerful Godfather now looked like a shadow, thinner, quieter, humbled. When our eyes met, he gave a weak smile. "Governor," he said softly, "you finally learned the game." I said nothing. He continued, his voice gravelly but calm. "I built this system. The bribery, the intimidation, the manipulation. I didn't create it because I loved corruption. I did it because it was the only way to survive it. Power in this land doesn't come clean, my boy. It comes covered in dust and blood." I stared at him through the glass. "And yet you became the very monster you claim to fight." He chuckled bitterly. "And you think you haven't?" That question hung in the air like a curse. For a moment, I saw something human in him. Not the tyrant, not the manipulator, but a tired old man who had built an empire only to be consumed by it. "Do you know what your real revenge should be?" he asked. "Not my arrest, not my humiliation. Change the system that made me possible, crush it, then you'll have won." The guard tapped his watch. Time was up. As I stood to leave, he called after me. "Be careful, my son. The lion you slay today might teach you how to roar tomorrow." For days after that meeting, his words haunted me, because deep down I knew he was right. You don't destroy corruption by removing one man. You destroy it by starving the system that feeds him. And I was about to do just that. I launched the Integrity Rebirth Project 2 weeks later, a total overhaul of state governance. Every contract now had to go through an open digital bidding system. All civil servants were to declare assets publicly. Departments that had been siphoning funds through ghost workers were audited. Ministries were merged. Redundant appointments were scrapped. The backlash was immediate. Hundreds of political loyalists resigned. Party elders accused me of betrayal. Even the press, once sympathetic, called it a political suicide mission. But I didn't care. Because for the first time in years, schools began to receive full allocations. Hospitals reopened. Roads got completed without contractors vanishing halfway. I remember one morning driving through the city and seeing schoolchildren in clean uniforms laughing as they crossed a bridge that had been abandoned for nearly a decade. That single moment made every sleepless night worth it. But it also came with a cost. I began to receive threats again, anonymous letters, shadowy vehicles following my convoy. My chief of staff warned that the old guard was regrouping. The Godfather might have fallen, but his proteges still held positions of influence, men who knew how to wait for their turn. And so I doubled my vigilance. I stopped attending night events. I changed my routes. I trusted fewer people. Power, I learned, doesn't make you safe. It only paints a larger target on your back. 3 years into my tenure, Chief Aachen died in custody. The news came early one morning. Chief Sylvanus Aachen, former political leader, dies of cardiac arrest. The radio played his old campaign jingles in tribute. Newspapers carried his image on their front pages. Some called him a villain, others a hero. But to me, he was both the man who tried to destroy me and the man who inadvertently taught me how to rebuild. I attended his burial quietly. No cameras, no convoy, just me and a handful of aides. As they lowered his casket into the red earth, I thought about everything that had happened, the manipulation, the betrayal, the revenge. And I realized something profound. In trying to destroy the Godfather, I had become a godfather of my own kind, the enforcer of a new order. The difference, I hoped, was that mine was built on accountability, not fear. But even then I couldn't be sure, because power, no matter how noble, always tests a man's soul. I left the cemetery before the final prayers. The sky was overcast, and a soft drizzle began to fall. My driver asked softly, "Sir, Are we heading back to the office? I looked out the window at the disappearing grave and whispered, "No, we're heading to the future." Years later, when my term ended, I walked out of office without regret. The Godfather's empire was gone, dismantled, audited, erased from history. But so was part of me. Politics changes a man, revenge consumes him, and justice demands his soul. I returned to the small house where I once planned my campaigns, the same one where Chief Aachen had first visited me years ago. The paint was peeling. The air was quiet. I sat by the window, watching the evening sun burn orange across the horizon, and thought about the circle of power, how every man believes he's different until the game changes him. In the end, perhaps Chief Aachen wasn't entirely wrong. To change the system, you have to understand its darkness. But to survive it, you must never forget the light. And as the last rays faded, I whispered to myself, "The Godfather is dead, but the lesson lives on."